Hi, everyone. I'm very excited and proud to be interviewing David Becker for the CityBiz audience. David's the executive director and founder of a nonpartisan group called Center for Election Innovation and Research. And they work with election officials in a totally bipartisan fashion and have been for quite a few years to increase the trust and integrity of our election process. David serves additionally as a CBS election law expert, and he's had many appearances. I imagine many of you have seen him on Face the Nation, other shows on CNN, MSNBC, and PBS. His work with CEIR has many hats and many directions, and we'll dig into them, including an election defense network, providing pro bono legal assistance to election officials who are threatened with frivolous criminal actions. Is varied and extensive work in helping Americans gain trust in the process. And additionally, he served 7 years as a senior attorney for the Department of Justice and the voting section department. I can go on and on, but we have limited time for the interview, although I would be remiss if I didn't mention that David was a two-time champion on Jeopardy and a winner on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. So welcome, David. I'm very excited to have you here.
Thank you very much, David. That was very much long in the past, even before during my DOJ days.
I would imagine so, but I found that intriguing. So we've just gone through an incredible election season. There's a lot of worry prior to the election of what might happen in terms to various actions that might have occurred that might have altered the trust and faith that Americans have in our election process. As you look back at it, overall, how do you view the election process that just went down November 5th?
I think that's really such an important question because I think a lot of people are asking themselves that question right now. I think what's really important here is to separate out the outcome of the election and the politics of the election from the process, which is where people like me and the election officials really live, what we focus on. We want the election to represent the true will of the American people, and we want that will to be carried out and have those who won govern us. That should be a core element. And unfortunately, for the last 4 years, that very key element of democracy, that we have elections that anyone who's eligible can vote in, and who they decide governs us actually takes office and does govern us, that's been challenged despite a lot of facts. So when I look back at what has occurred over these past few weeks and all of the work that went into it, regardless of how you feel about the outcome of the election, and there are lots of people who are understandably disappointed or even distressed, it was a triumph of public service. It was a remarkable process where, if I had said to all of you who are listening on November 4th that we're going to have a process that foreign adversaries are going to try to interfere with, they're going to call in bomb threats, they're going to spread fake videos, there are going to be domestic actors who spread lies about the process and how secure our voting is, we're going to have a couple of ballot drop boxes firebombed in the Pacific Northwest. There are allegedly going to be hundreds of thousands of kind of weaponized observers at polling places, potentially intimidating voters. And even after the election, we could see a long, drawn-out battle over whether the person who won actually won, and people trying to install the loser as the winner. And in all of that, we actually saw a very smooth process, no reports of voter intimidation, virtually no reports of lines. Well over half, about 55% of all ballots cast earlier by mail. The second highest number of ballots ever cast in American history. And the second highest turnout rate in the last 100 years, second only in both cases to 2020. Turnout in 2024, when all the ballots are finally counted, will have a higher turnout rate than even the 2008 Obama election. So those were all successes. And we have a process we have a clear winner where everyone, largely, certainly the the candidates and others are largely accepting the results of that election. And the certification process, which many of us have worked so hard to strengthen and support over these past few years, is playing out perfectly. The audits and the paper ballots are playing out. Georgia just completed its very comprehensive audit of all of its paper ballots yesterday, and those audits absolutely confirmed the results in the state of Georgia. So it was a tremendously successful election in terms of the democratic process, and that's really thanks to the hard work of the men and women, Republicans and Democrats all over the country, hundreds of thousands of them, who run our elections, who oversee our elections and facilitate our voice. I mean, it's nice that they are not experiencing the kind of threats and harassment in the immediate aftermath of this election that they experienced over the last 4 years based on lies spread by losing candidates.
Well, that's great to hear. I mean, because of the importance of the work we're all doing to try to have Americans trust in our system and to vote in greater numbers. You mentioned a lot of potential dangers related to weaponized observers and foreign actors. Is it possible, or would this be too speculative for me to ask you this question, or you give me an answer to this question, that if the election had been as close as people had thought it would be, might some of those actions actually been significant enough that they could have impacted the results?
So first of all, I think it is too speculative to say that it would have actually impacted the results. There's no evidence that all of this effort impacted the results. We've heard from Trump supporters in 2020 unsupported claims that the something related to blah, 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 Hunter Biden laptop affected the results or affected how voters might have behaved. We heard the same thing in 2016 about various October surprises, the Access Hollywood tape, the James Comey letter. There's no evidence that those actually significantly changed the outcome. Even the bomb threats, which did close down polling places for short periods of time, courts ordered those polling places to stay open a little bit longer to basically cover that time. The ballots that, and it was a very small number of ballots in the Pacific Northwest and two ballot drop boxes, one in Vancouver, Washington, one in the Portland area in Oregon. Those ballots, they tracked into the voters down. If there was a very small number of ballots, those ballots were replaced largely. It's really remarkable how resilient our system was. Again, thanks to the processes we've had in place, largely the same process that exists in 2020, and thanks to the election officials. But I think we also have to acknowledge that one of the reasons people like me right now have a little more free time on our hands than we might have had otherwise has nothing to do with the margin of victory, has nothing to do with the processes we have in place. It is 100% due to the outcome of the election, because former President Trump and now President-elect Trump, who I should say won legitimately in 2024 and won legitimately in 2016. I said so at the time, and I will say it again, as Biden did in 2020. But former President Trump and now President-elect Trump has made it all too clear that he would be willing to spread disinformation, incite his supporters if he lost. And so there was preparations along those lines in case he had lost, regardless of the margin. And I think that would have likely come to fruition, and there would have been a lot of work by people like me and the Center for Election Innovation and Research, but many, many others and election officials around the country to really hold those guardrails around our institutions fast as we were preparing for some degree of attacks on the counting process, on the certification process, on the ascertainment of electors, on the meeting of electors, on the joint session of Congress. And of course, now we're not going to see any of that when it comes to the presidential race, because we have a clear winner. That winner has accepted the results, as winners do. And the loser of the election has accepted the results, as in all but one presidential election in our history, losers of elections do.
Well, a quick question, and then I'll focus a little bit more on the future than the past. I know the Center for Election Innovation and Research has spent a considerable amount of time preparing for and actually helping poll workers to respond to lawsuits, frivolous lawsuits. Did you not find many this year? Are you in the process still of adjudicating some? Can you ensure, or would you be positive in feeling that all in all, the poll workers were protected and Americans should be comfortable in becoming poll workers in the future?
So there's a lot there, and I'll try to get into all of it. It's a really important question. So the Center for Election Innovation and Research founded the Election Official Legal Defense Network, which people can find out about at eoldn.org, which stands for Election Official Legal Defense Network. And it was the brainchild of Bob Bauer, former Obama counsel, and Ben Ginsberg, former Bush and Romney counsel, who co-chair it still. And what we do is we recruit a network of volunteer attorneys all over the country, working with law firms and individual attorneys. We have over 10,000 who are ready to serve and advise and assist election officials in any needs they have related to their official duties. And it's not just poll workers. It's everyone from secretaries of state all the way down to volunteer poll workers, anyone who works in the election space. And it doesn't necessarily have to relate to lawsuits or criminal prosecutions. It could just be advice. Over the course of the past 3.5 years, roughly, where it's been in existence, there have been dozens and dozens of requests for assistance that EOLDN lawyers have met the call for. It's been in nearly half the states where these have occurred, not just battleground states, but all kinds of states. And we have seen over the course of the last several months an uptick in requests as we were heading into the election and as more disinformation was spreading, as people who had been fed a steady diet of lies about the integrity of our election system were harassing election officials in many places. I will say even in the past couple of weeks since the election, we're seeing a continued uptick in requests. All that said, it's mostly not poll workers. It's mostly the professional election workers. What we saw in this election cycle was, again, millions of Americans answered the call to be volunteer poll workers. My teenage son was one of them, and I'm incredibly proud of him for that. And what all of them found was a safe, rewarding experience, probably a very, very long day, lots of training. But that experience is really important because what those people find, and what the people who are getting their news about our elections solely within their social media bubbles don't understand, is that there are so many checks and balances and redundancies and transparencies in the process that it's effectively impossible to steal a major election. And there's a reason that poll workers have to go through training before they serve. There's a reason they have to swear an oath. There's a reason that there's many poll workers and multiple transparencies so that no one individual can affect anything without other eyeballs on it. There's a reason they show up hours before the polls open, and there's a reason they stay hours after they close. And that's because our system has a tremendous amount of integrity in processes that require them to do things in such a way that there's no way that it could result ultimately in a wrong decision. The will of the voters is going to control. So we're very proud to provide this service to election officials and poll workers. But I have to admit, I'm a little sad we live in a country where a nonprofit like mine has to provide this service. And I look forward to the day, hopefully in the near future, where we can sunset this service because it's no longer needed. But right now, the requests for EOLDN services are probably close to their peak, even with a successful, clear, safe, secure election. And if anyone is a lawyer and wants to serve, you can go to eoldn.org and sign up there. And if you're an election official listening, same thing, go to eoldn.org. All requests are confidential. We do not share them. It's totally up to the election official involved. And unfortunately, I anticipate it's going to be necessary to keep this service going for quite some time.
Extremely interesting. I did a lot of research to prepare for this interview, and I consider that I have some knowledge on this general subject, but I came across the Election Registration Information Center, and maybe you can explain that a little more to our CityBiz listeners, but it provides an enormous amount of data on voter records to states across the country so they can easily register more voters, which should be everybody's goal in our country. But I believe and correct me if I'm wrong, that 8 or 9 states have dropped out of this service. Is that true, number one? And number two, might they regret doing so? Might they come back? And how does that play into future elections?
Yeah, so the Electronic Registration Information Center, or ERIC for short, is something that I'm very proud of because I led the effort to create it. And it was bringing together states across the country who were trying to find a better way to maintain their voter lists, keep voter lists up to date. It's hard to keep voter lists up to date because people move. About a third of all Americans move in any given 4-year period. Of course, people also die and need to be removed from the voter list. And states were looking for a better way to do that. And they didn't really have a way of sharing data across states because while people sometimes move within states, they also move across states. So ERIC was founded in 2012 with a bipartisan group of 7 states, and at its peak grew to well over 30 states. But and equal numbers of states run by Republicans and Democrats, which is really important. ERIC is a data center that securely allows the states to share data with themselves, match it using highly sophisticated software so that they get information that says, John Smith from your state just got a driver's license in another state, so they can contact that person and try to remove them from the list. And that's really hard to do because it's really hard to take data on John Smith from one list and John Smith from another list and know that you've got the same John Smith. States have found it incredibly successful. It's one of those rare bipartisan success stories. It both helps them get eligible voters onto the lists. They just send a postcard to people who aren't registered and tell them, here's how you get registered. And it also helps take ineligible people because they moved away or that kind of thing off the list. So in recent years, it was such a bipartisan success story that extremists started targeting it with lies. Lies about what its funding sources were, lies about how it was run. ERIC is run by the states that comprise it. It is not run by any entity. I don't run it. I've never seen the data inside of ERIC ever. The funding comes from the states themselves. Pew provided some seed funding at the very beginning, but the states fund it on an annual basis. And all of the data is secured incredibly well, probably better than a lot of the state systems themselves. So it protects that data and anonymizes that data so it can't be used even if it were hacked into. ERIC is this great success story, but again, the extremists who have tried to tear down election integrity by making false claims about our systems targeted it because it was such a success. And that led several states, all Republican-led, to succumb to that disinformation, unfortunately. And David, you raise a really good point. What they're finding is they're scrambling. They no longer have access to good data to keep their lists clean. They no longer have access to ERIC data, which helps them identify voter fraud. After every major election, they get a list of voters that possibly double voted across state lines, which they can prosecute. Some of the states that left literally put out press releases about the prosecutions they did as a result of ERIC the day before they announced they were leaving ERIC. They're not going to be able to do that anymore. I don't know if there's going to be a change over time and a kind of a reset back to reality. I hope there is, because it's the single best tool for keeping voter lists up to date, which helps elections run smoothly. And right now, many of those states are trying to create the impression that they're doing something similar, and the fact is they can't. There's no way to do this on your own. There's no way to do this even state to state. It requires a consortium of states working together with very sophisticated data and very high levels of cybersecurity. So I don't know what's going to happen with ERIC, but the good news is ERIC's still very much alive and well. 24 states in D.C. are still in ERIC. It's still a bipartisan group of states. I expect there will be other states that are looking very closely at joining ERIC. Some of the biggest states that aren't in ERIC are actually, just to prove that it's not Democratic or Republican, California and New York aren't in ERIC right now. Texas and Florida dropped out of ERIC. But, states like Illinois are in ERIC. States like Utah are in ERIC. States like Michigan are in ERIC. States like Georgia are in ERIC. So it's a very bipartisan group of states, and I think we're going to continue to see over time the utility of ERIC winning out and states coming back.
Well, that would be great, which almost leads into my next question, because working on ERIC in the next few years to enhance it, increase the size of it, I'm sure is something you'll be working on. But my general question is, I imagine many of our listeners are thinking, well, election's over. There's nothing for David Becker to do for the next 3 years. He's going to, go off and relax somewhere. I know sort of the answer to this, but I'm sure there's a lot of work that goes on year round, year after year, in off-election years, as well as the key even-numbered election years. So what is the process? What are your main focus? What will your main focus be in the next year or two?
Well, so I appreciate that. So first of all, obviously the Election Official Legal Defense Network is still going to be a major focus of ours. It's, like I said, the demand for services is at its peak right now, and we're going to be continuing raising money and recruiting lawyers to ensure that we can provide a lawyer to any election official who needs it. Research is part of our name, so we're going to be looking at a lot of the data. There's a lot of questions about how long it takes to count ballots. I think those questions are understandable. I think there's a legitimate reason it takes a while, but I think there's also ways that we can do better. So there are things we can do along those lines. There are legitimate ways that we can improve integrity of the process without reducing access to the process. One of the things we've researched for quite some time and are working very actively on is what we generally call convenience voting, early in-person voting and mail voting, and having those options spread, because they've been tremendously successful, not just for access, but for security. Because when we spread voting out over a number of days and over a number of different methods of voting, you actually can identify any potential problem earlier on. If you have a power outage or a traffic problem, or if you have machine problems, or if there's disinformation or some kind of cyber attack, it's far better to discover that in an early voting process than it is on election day if all of your voting is there. And the good news is we've been very successful in that. And when I say we, I mean we as a society, not just CEIR. 97% of all voters in 2024 had access to early in-person voting. The only states that didn't were Alabama, Mississippi, and New Hampshire. 36 states and DC offer no excuse mail voting. That's the highest number ever. That number is likely to increase, we hope. And yet at the same time, we'll try to work with the states to do research on this and help them figure out how to better improve their processes. I think we should also understand to some degree, given the next administration's likely hostility to some of the reality around our election security, that there's going to be some degree of playing defense here, that there might be a federal bill that tries to weaken some of the guardrails around our institutions, around democracy, and around our electoral processes, that try to actually reduce the amount of early voting or mail voting, that try to impose really bad ideas like hand counts of ballots, which would take even longer and be less accurate. So I think we're going to be working very closely with people on both sides of the aisle in Congress to see to make sure that their decisions about electoral process are informed by the professionals, by election officials, by reality and what happens in those states. And I think there's also opportunities in the states to do both defensive, prevent some bad ideas from taking hold, but also potentially propose some good ideas. Pennsylvania is a state that requires that really needs some improvement of their processes. This is only their second presidential election with mail voting. And mail voting is not as efficient there as it could be, and that's largely due to some clarifications that the legislature has failed to make in the laws to date. And I think there's some opportunities, given Pennsylvania also has a divided legislature. It's one of the few states with the Democrats controlling one house and the Republicans in the other house. So there's an opportunity for compromise there. So we're going to be working very hard in several states where we've been working closely with election officials. We're going to be working closely with people in Congress who want to know what's really working and what's not working, and those are people on both sides of the aisle. And we're going to be continuing to do research that will inform those efforts. And then lastly, as you've already noted and we've talked extensively, we're going to be making sure that the public servants who run our elections never have to worry about going out of pocket to prevent harassment or abuse, that they have someone who will have their backs, and we're always going to have their backs.
All very fascinating. And I imagine the task is even more complicated with changes in technology. I just spoke to a gentleman, and he's got a name for it, but Bradley Tusk, who is a strong proponent of using your cell phone, to vote. Is that an area that you get into at all, analyzing technology and what is potentially dangerous, what could be a major positive to improve turnout? Is that in your area, or is that sort of something? It is.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, look, there are opportunities that technology affords. Eric is a great example of that. But there's also places where technology does not provide the answers that people think it does. We should recognize, first of all, I've been working in this space for 25 years. I have heard of about literally hundreds of ideas that were guaranteed to improve turnout. And the fact is, there's no evidence that any of them by themselves increase turnout. If one thing that was perceived to increase turnout could work, we would not have seen the highest turnout in American history during an election when it was the hardest to vote in 2020 during a global pandemic. There are too many factors that affect whether individuals turn out to vote. I will tell you that when it comes to things like internet and mobile voting, the research here is very, very clear. Our systems are not yet secure enough for this, and even if they were, it is a very, very risky idea right now, given that there is so much distrust of our system. Can you imagine in Georgia in 2020, which had its first election with all paper ballots in 2 decades, if instead all of their ballots were cast by mobile device and had no paper record, and what Donald Trump and his supporters would have done? But instead what we had is the state of Georgia counted every single paper ballot, which had the words Trump or Biden on them, by hand in front of bipartisan, transparent sets of observers statewide. They counted 5 million ballots in 5 days. Can you imagine if there were no paper ballots you could show that you just have to say, oh, don't worry, there's this encrypted algorithm / app on our phones that you can trust. And there's a computer scientist will tell you can trust it. That would not have carried any weight. So it's really important we have a system that can be shown to lay people, particularly supporters of the losing candidates, that can show your work, that can show why we know that certain voters lost. And this is why in some areas like voter registration, sophisticated technology and data can work very well. But in actually casting of ballots, the best technology right now is paper ballots counted by machines because they're accurate and faster, and then audited by hand to confirm that the machines reach the right count. And that's what we've got right now, and it's really state of the art. David, one of the things I often hear is, why can't we do like France does, where they have all paper ballots and they count them all by hand in one night? Their paper ballots literally list one contest on them, President of France. And you could theoretically do that, one central election authority, one type of ballot for everyone in France with one race on it. I think there's literally different pieces of color pieces of paper too. Maricopa County, Arizona, just for example, and people listening will probably think back to their ballots. Maricopa County had 79 different contests on their 4-page ballot in 2020. You can't count that by hand in a night. You need machines to do that.
In this way, we're running out of time. You said there's all these ideas on what could increase voter turnout. And if I'm paraphrasing, I believe you said there's no way we can say what will or won't exactly do that. Well, I'm going to disagree slightly, because I can say that the work you do, have done, will be doing in the future, that gives Americans more faith in our system, is probably, well, definitely helping to increase knowledge, and with knowledge goes trust, and with trust goes the desire to participate in our democratic process. So thank you for everything you do.
Thank you. That's very kind, and I won't reject that. I'll take it. I'll absolutely take it. I admire all of those people who continue to try to work for better voter turnout, even if there's not one single magic bullet that'll do it.
There we go. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, David.